Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session on mainstreaming climate disclosures. I'm David Carlin. I'll be your host and moderator today. Um, Looking forward to a good discussion. If you bear with us for just a moment, we're just getting our keynote speaker set up, and then we will be with you very shortly. So we'll begin actually with an introduction from our panelists, and hopefully Bob Litterman, who is the chair of the panel on the from the CFTC's latest report around climate risks in the financial system, will be able to join us. But what we'll do first is a few-minute introduction of our panelists today on mainstreaming climate risks. And the first person I'll have speak is Teresa Lober. She is the head of the Climate Risk Hub at the Bank of England, as well as working with the Network for Greening the Financial System. And she'll talk a bit about her work first. So over to you, Teresa.
No.
Oh, we just heard you, Teresa, there for a second.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can. Yes.
Okay. All right. It still says off, but thank you very much.
It's strange. But...
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak and be part of this discussion on a So we're obviously in the Bank of England, we're engaged in a whole range of activities on disclosure and scenario analysis, but I thought I'd focus on the aspect of why scenario analysis is really important, and it's really important for disclosure specifically. I think one of the key challenges we face when thinking about climate risks is to size that risk, to actually understand it so we can manage it. And in order to understand the risks, we need to not only understand them right now, but we need to understand what they will look like in the future. And I think the best way for us to do that, and for firms to do that, is to do scenario analysis and think about how a firm might be exposed under different future pathways and different scenarios, so we can test transition risks at the moment, what the future will look like. But we know we will get a combination of physical and transition risks, so we need to think ahead and understand those risks in the future. And the key point for taking a strategic approach rather than be focused on the static right now, because scenario analysis is hard, and I won't pretend it isn't. What we have done at the Bank of England is, as part of our supervisory expectations that we published last year, we're asking firms to do disclosure and to do scenario analysis separately, both for risk management purposes, but also for disclosure purposes. And because firms keep telling us this is something they're really struggling with, we have decided that we need to actively help them on both of those fronts. And we've set up jointly with the FCA what is known as the Climate Financial Risk Forum. So this is a forum across industry that brings in banks, insurance companies, and asset managers to share expertise across industry, to learn from each other where firms are, have developed leading practice. And actually, this forum published a guide this summer on disclosure and scenario analysis, but also on risk management and innovation, to help those firms who are only just starting out how they might be able to approach these important topics. But at the bank, we've also decided to run a stress test, a climate stress test. So this is quite a novel exercise. And And we will be testing, again, a combination of transition and physical risks across 3 different scenarios. And we'll be testing the largest banks and insurers for these risks. And the purpose of that exercise is threefold. So we want to understand how individual firms are exposed to these different risks, but also how the system as a whole is exposed, and where there might be interlinkages that we as a regulator need to understand. We want to understand how firms might respond under those different stresses and under those different scenarios, and how sustainable their business models are in that future world. And we want firms to use this exercise to develop their risk management practices. Again, because this is difficult, we want them to use this exercise to build capabilities and modeling expertise so they can do scenario analysis. Now, in order for this to happen, we will be providing very detailed scenarios to the firm so they can do these exercises. In the first instance, we're giving them to the largest firms that we're asking to participate in this exercise, but obviously they will be available to a whole range of other firms who, if they want to use these scenarios, they'll be very welcome to use them for their own, for their own understanding, to understand size the risk, but also to use it for the risk management and their disclosure. And all these in order to develop these scenarios. And I should say, importantly, we're not the only central bank who is sort of embarking on this exercise. There's quite a few central banks who are actually thinking about running a stress test to do this. Now trying to design these scenarios, and we are working with a range of other central banks and a consortium of climate academics on developing the climate scenarios that underlie these stress tests. And we're doing this as part of the Network for Greening the Financial System. So this is the network of now more than 70 central banks and regulators who are working together, again, to share expertise, to deal with the challenges that climate change poses to central banks and regulators. And we're working with a consortium of climate scientists, and Elmar leads that consortium, who's on the call as well, to develop climate scenarios that bring together the climate science and the economics. And I think that's where the two disciplines come together, and that's why this in particular is so difficult, to make sure what the climate scientists already know we can translate for the financial sector into the macro financial space and apply. And so I'm very happy to say more about the scenarios, but I'm sure Elmar will be better placed to speak to those. I think the important point is that this is very much, I think, the direction we're moving in, both for risk management purposes, but also for disclosure purposes. So it's very much something where we're hoping to provide input into the central banking community and beyond that, actually into the financial sector. And we published the first cut of these scenarios in June of this year. We're now working to expand on them and build on them and publish an updated set in spring of next year. And these are all publicly available. So I would encourage anyone on the call who's involved in this field and who's from a financial institution and thinking about it to have a look and actually consider using them. They are designed for central banks in the first instance, but there's no reason why financial firms can't use them, especially once they've been complemented by a more macroeconomic analysis from the central banks.
Teresa, thank you so much. I think that's a really wonderful overview, and it also will feed well into our next panelist and speaker, Elmar Kriegler. And he leads the Transition Pathways Research Group at the Potsdam Institute, and we'll talk about some of that work as it relates to climate scenarios for the financial sector. So over to you, Elmar.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David, and thanks a lot for having me at this roundtable. Very happy to be here and talk a bit about our work that we do in terms of exploring futures, climate change futures, and how our work can then be used in the context of financial analysis. So first, what do we do? What we do is we try to map out climate protection strategies over the century to reach long-term climate targets. But we also look into scenarios that wouldn't reach those political climate targets and end up with 3 degrees or 4 degrees and look at the consequences of this happening. And a major tool we are using are so-called integrated assessment models. So these are models that couple the energy system, the land use system, economic components, and basically try to understand how we would need to transform the way we use energy, the way we use land in order to limit warming, to stop warming, and to reach these climate goals as they are laid out, for example, in the Paris Agreement. A key thing here is to understand that what we are doing is kind of a strategic planning exercise. So they are strategic planning tools. We can't predict the future. It's highly complex. So what we're using are scenarios to understand what can happen and what should happen given some societal goals. And that is work that is increasingly taken up by a larger group of users. Of course, our primary users were policymakers and stakeholders involved in the political discourse about climate change and climate protection. But we have seen these scenarios also now being used, for example, by the private sector. For example, in the context of science-based targets initiatives, where they try to explore company targets that would be aligned with long-term political goals, and using some of those scenarios. And of course, and that's the topic here, the finance sector. I think a lot of this work has been triggered by the TCFD, with its recommendations also to use scenarios, 2-degree scenarios, to explore the implications. So let me talk a bit about the work we do with the NGFS. Teresa already introduced it. So this is work we do along a matrix that the NGFS has conceived about different futures. One is an orderly future, where we now act to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Another one is a disorderly future, where we still reach the goals, but we don't do it in an orderly way. So we have fragmented action, we might delay the action, then we need to do more later. And then there are also these scenarios that don't meet the targets, and where we have some significant climate impacts to expect. So it's also about trying to bring together the transition and the financial risk. So important issues here, or important variables of interest, as we found out during this process, was to look at things like the fossil fuel energy markets, like fossil fuel prices, the energy deployments and energy technology deployments over the next years, investments, carbon prices is an important quantity. So these are all important information. And one important topic for us is to convey in a transparent and clear manner to those users how those quantities or projections emerge from the design of the scenarios, from the assumptions that we put in. So let me talk very quickly about another activity, which is we do with the UNEP Finance Initiative, where we also provide those scenarios, but now not for use with the regulators, but for use by private banks. That have an interest to understand, for example, the changes to the risk of default of their portfolios due to, for example, a 2-degree world or something like that. And here we developed a concept of so-called risk factor pathways, where we try to distill the critical information from these scenarios that then could be taken up by analysts in the banks and then broken down to their companies and their asset portfolio. And those risk factor pathways are, just very briefly, the direct emission costs of the sector. This is carbon price times emissions. The indirect upstream emission costs, so that your input gets more expensive. Changes to the revenues. And my time is up, so let me just make this. Oops. All right, so I have to stop now. I can't stop it.
I will just have the audience know that this this was a self-imposed timer and not us, at the Oscars playing Elmar off. But Elmar, thank you very much for your remarks, and we'll get a little bit more into that in the remaining session. But to move on to Val Smith, who is City's Chief Sustainability Officer. Val and her teams have been involved in those UNEP-FI pilots that you mentioned from the beginning, and as an institution that has really done a lot on understanding climate risks, but also moving the ball forward on climate disclosures. it'll be great to hear from her about some of City's experiences, and then we'll jump into a little bit more of an open discussion amongst the four of us.
Sure. Thanks, David. Happy to share. Just let me make sure you can hear me okay.
Yep. All good.
Great. So it's, first of all, just great to be here, not just with UNEP-FI, but also with Teresa and with Elmar, because I feel like this is the ecosystem of our influencers at Citi as we've really worked to implement and disclose along the TCFD recommendations. So just want to thank you all and acknowledge all of the work that you're doing that I think sets institutions like Citi up to be able to disclose. So just to sort of frame it out, I'll talk a little bit about Citi's experiences implementing TCFD. We also recently released a 2025 Sustainable Progress Strategy, which lays out our broader climate change strategy in terms of both the opportunity and the risk side. And so we will be talking a lot more about that in our TCFD disclosures. But to sort of rewind for a moment, shortly after Citi's, our CEO, Mike Corbett, signed the statement of support when the TCFD recommendations were released, we immediately identified a lot of different areas that we had to make progress on, but one in particular was related to climate scenario analysis. And that was what led us to engage with UNEP-FI and 15 other institutions to participate in the first UNEP-FI pilot project on climate scenario analysis. We ended up doing 2 transition risk scenarios that were developed by the Potsdam Institute, and also did a 4-degree physical risk scenario. And, you know, I think the benefit of working collaboratively with the other banks and with UNEP-FI through this exercise was that it gave us a way to get started without knowing all of the answers. And I think that a common theme that's coming up is around building capabilities. We know that regulators and investors and stakeholders are going to be asking us more and more to disclose what we're learning, to disclose more metrics. And I think right now we're in this moment of innovation and building muscle memory so that we can meet those expectations. So briefly, what we've done, we participated in the pilot climate scenario analyses. We, I think, had some interesting learnings from that around the different indicators for resilience in different sectors. We specifically were focusing on our U.S. power sector and our North American oil and gas exploration and production portfolio. So, you know, following that pilot project, we published our first standalone TCFD report at the end of 2018. And then we felt like we were really at sort of a decision tree point where there were a lot of different ways that we could take this work forward. So we convened a half-day investor dialogue in New York back when we could all get together in person and got input from different types of investors about how to take this work forward. That led us to do our second climate scenario analysis exercise, which we completed at the beginning of this year, which was different. We decided to, as a complement for the longer term climate scenario analyses that we had completed, to do a short-term climate stress test, focusing in on a carbon price as the stressor, and again, looking at our oil and gas exploration and production portfolio as the portfolio to stress. We're now working on our next standalone TCFD report. And so the way that we've approached disclosure, just to sort of tie this up, is a combination of standalone disclosure reports focusing on TCFD and climate analysis and disclosure, special sections in our annual ESG report so that we can have more sort of real-time reporting about not just what we're learning from our TCFD implementation, but what the process is and what the learnings are from the process. And then finally, I think another important piece of our disclosure is really around the engagements that we're having. Engagements like this, but also a lot of one-on-one engagements with our investors where we can sort of share real time what we're learning, what questions are being raised, and get input as we develop. So I'll just sort of close by noting that when we started this journey, and we're not done yet. With each step, we realize what more we have to do. But when we started, I think the audience was much more narrow than it is today. You know, there was a smaller set of stakeholders, a group of investors that really understood what was going on, some regulators starting to pay attention, and now I think the audience for this kind of disclosure and the expectations, certainly for banks and for some of our client sectors as well, are really growing, and that we are being asked to disclose around climate risk and also climate impact. And so I can talk more about what that means later.
Great, Val. Thanks so much, and it's good timing because my first question to the panel was going to be about why climate disclosures and climate risks matter to the financial sector, but I'm not really sure there's anyone better to discuss that than Bob Litterman, who is here with us. He is the founder of Kepos Capital. He also was the chairman behind the CFTC's latest report on climate risks in the financial sector. So I'm going to let him kind of tie some of these strands together between scenarios, institutions, and regulation. So Bob, eager to hear some perspectives from you about climate risks and disclosures.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. And I apologize. It took me a little bit of effort here to get into this session, but I did have the honor. It was a real privilege to chair this CFTC subcommittee. It was a tremendous group of people, really a lot of expertise, including Val's colleague, Liza Eubank, and also we had some nice discussions with the Bank of England, including Teresa and her colleague, Sarah Breeden. So it was a year-long effort. We came up with an awful lot of good recommendations, and including, the central recommendation, which is we have to price carbon. I mean, the fundamental problem that we all face globally is that we don't have appropriate incentives to reduce emissions. And we said, look, it's an urgent problem. We have to solve it. It's the most important thing we have to do. So we talked about a lot of other things, and pricing wasn't our focus, but that is the fundamental problem that all of us have to get changed immediately. Should have been done 20 years ago. We can't change history here, but we've got to change this, and it's got to be global and it's got to be harmonized. So that's where we're going. But the rest of the report was focused on regulators and the participants in the financial system and how to manage their risk. And there's really both the bottoms-up approach, which is what all the different companies and other folks in the financial markets think about in managing their own risk. But there's also the systemic risk to the financial system that's a top-down approach. And I would say what's really tough, and we all have to work together to solve this over the next several years, is to make the connection between the risks that are faced locally and by individual companies versus the systemic risk and the scenarios and the analysis that we have to do to understand the systemic risk is really very different than the individual risks that individual companies are looking at. And then portfolio managers are maybe somewhere in between and asset owners, because they have to look at all of the risks in their portfolios. And those are going to be from different sectors and different localities and have different components. So how do we make those connections is really part of the problem. Now, the TCFD did give us a great framework. And in the CFTC report, we absolutely said we have to use that TCFD framework, but it's a start. We need leadership from the regulatory community, and then we need an iterative process going back and forth. And we need both the, I would say, from the data and analytics perspective, both the incentives that are provided by the private sector trying to make a profit in providing this data and this analysis, but also much of it needs to be public. And so one of our recommendations is that the regulators should really encourage the development of both that public data and a platform to use it, a kind of an open source platform would be very helpful. But also the private sector developing data and analysis to try and help push that forward. So I'll stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
Well, Bob, thanks so much. And you mentioned leadership, and I know that for us working on this issue, we really appreciate the leadership that you and the subcommittee showed with that report. I think it's one of those things that both can't be said enough, but it also becomes far more important as we think about the future of climate risk as a financial risk. And so I'm excited to now open it up for the remaining 15 minutes or so to this group to really think about with a group of leaders in their respective spaces on this issue, where they see climate disclosures going, how they see scenarios being applied, how the interaction and engagement continues between these different parties, such as institutions, modelers, regulators. And as I said, it's really, I aspire to have a discussion here. So please jump in, whoever would like to start, and then we'll kind of pass it around and get some perspectives from you all.
Well, first of all, I think the Bank of England is probably ahead of the rest of us in terms of developing the scenarios and making these connections, because they've been thinking about it longer and working on it, I think, a lot longer than we have. But as I see it, obviously there's two components: transition risk and physical risk. And the Bank of England framework I like, which is to say, there's kind of the scenarios we have to think about is a rapid transition followed by less physical impacts versus a slower transition followed by greater physical impacts. In fact, and the Bank of England, I think, helpfully suggests different pricing paths along those different scenarios. The way I've been thinking about it, which is very similar, but it's kind of, when are we going to price emissions? We haven't really started. I would say, emissions continue to go up. We haven't created those incentives. When we create those incentives, I've done some work on this. I call it slamming on the brakes. We need to have high incentives to reduce emissions because we have to be prepared for worst case outcomes, for an environment that is more fragile than we expect, and for more difficulty reducing emissions because of technology. I mean, hopefully we'll get good technology, and it'll be cheap 10 years from now to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Well, cheap, everything's relative. It's always going to be expensive, but you know what I mean? We don't know what it's going to cost to clean up our pollution and to pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Worst case, it doesn't get a lot cheaper, and it's a tremendous liability on the future. So that's what we have to be prepared for. And the question is, when do we slam on the brakes? We should have done it 20 years ago. We all know that. We should do it immediately. But if we don't do it, that's when we get those bigger physical impacts. And quite frankly, I think that we are going to do it soon. So that's the scenario that I expect, but we should look at scenarios where we don't do it soon. And what does that mean?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to really tee up both the work that Elmar has done, many of the things, Bob, that you mentioned around carbon pricing and technologies are key components in his models. When we talk about when we hit those brakes, of course, that's the immediate action versus delayed that Teresa and Elmar have worked on. And then as a user and a strategist, I think Val has some really good perspective on how to take those pieces and apply them. So for the three of you, I'd be also really interested to hear going forward, both how these scenarios, how these kind of components of the scenarios will impact the work that you're doing in this space.
I'm happy to start. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I think the really positive here is that the financial sector has moved massively in its understanding that this is a risk that it needs to address. So I feel like 5 years ago when we started out in the field, there was a lot of criticism about even thinking about this, and we had to do a lot of kind of education why it is a risk. And now the conversation we're having is totally a different one. And I feel like it's really shifted from the why to the how. How can we actually do this? To Bob's point, we can think of some tools. Can we actually implement them? And so it's about developing scenarios as one of the many tools, is having the data platforms to make sure the information is available. And I think disclosure is a really key part of that, to make the information available to the market. I think where we need to move, in the absence of stricter regulation and clearer climate policy, the financial sector has a really key role to lead here. And I think scenario analysis is one way of making the financial sector understand, what it could mean to, wait for a late disorderly transition, how much higher the costs would be, how much higher the risks, and that the financial sector can take a proactive role here to prevent that and actually lead the transition that we need to see across the real economy. And so ultimately, I think where we need to end up is that every financial decision includes climate change. Every financial decision takes it into account, understands the risks and understands the opportunities. So I think that's what I kind of see as the end point of disclosure, of scenario analysis, that we take a strategic approach, that individual firms take a strategic approach of where are they, on what side of the transition are they, and how can they be on the right side of it.
Val and Elmar, thoughts from you?
Sure, I'm happy to go next, Elmar. So I couldn't agree more with Teresa's last points as well as with Bob's. And I think that Bob made a really important reference to the systemic risks as well as the firm risks. And I think that the emerging sort of double materiality related to climate change, where you're looking at climate risk and the financial risk to an institution from climate change, but also climate impact, I think that sort of dual lens helps us to approximate the systemic risks. And the work that we're doing, sort of looking ahead, as one firm's example of how we're implementing and trying to, keep moving to meet emerging expectations, is, I would categorize it partly as building our internal infrastructure and partly as building our toolkit of resources and tools. So on the internal infrastructure, and I think actually following along the 4 pillars of the TCFD recommendations is a really elegant way to develop this. And as we're working on our next TCFD report right now, we're really thinking about, like, what does our end game look like? What's the future state? So, in terms of internal infrastructure, do we have the appropriate sort of oversight and executive management oversight all the way down from the board? How are we sort of pulling together cross-functional groups to tackle different pieces of climate risk, to tackle different questions around our climate impact? And so we've spent the last couple of years really, I think, trying to build out some of that internal infrastructure so that we have the network of expertise in place inside Citi, so that we can continue to implement and meet these emerging expectations. And then the tools, I would say, the tools that we are focused on is, I think the end state in scenario analysis probably looks like having a suite or a stable of scenarios, perhaps the ones that are recommended by NGFS, but it's not going to be a static set of scenarios. They will be like living scenarios and emerging and evolving. And as institutions, we have to stay up to speed with those, but having a set of climate scenarios for transition risk, for physical risk, and implementing them periodically to see what we learn, what we learn about a particular client sector, what we learn about specific clients, what we learn about our own financial risk. And I think those scenarios are complemented by the emerging focus on measurement. And I think the measurement piece also speaks to both climate impact as well as climate risk. So we're road testing PACTA right now, the Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment, which looks at alignment of portfolios with the Paris Agreement 2-degree objectives. Also, we're beginning work under PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, to essentially measure absolute carbon emissions associated with our loan books. And I think that it's this suite of portfolios that will help both with the strategy development of climate change as well as the metrics and targets. I think that portfolio, combined with ever increasing disclosure, which does drive performance in this area. It's been amazing to see how much disclosure does really drive climate performance. I think that's sort of our end state, is that we want to have, sort of firing on all cylinders, to use an old economy terminology, to really address climate change and make sure we're meeting our stakeholder and investor expectations.
That's great. And Val, you mentioned some of the tools, and obviously with Elmar, your work being in the development of scenarios, and from the things that the other three panelists have spoken about, I'd be really keen to hear your discussions of kind of future engagements with the financial sector, as well as directions that that you see your work going to both develop and provide some of those tools that have been mentioned. Yeah. So if you just unmute, so you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There we go. Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a bit weird because it still tells me I'm off with the microphone, but you can hear me. That's great. Yep. Made me a bit nervous. So, let me say one thing first before I come, how we want to continue engagement with the finance sector. The question is, of course, if you look at those scenarios, you can look at them through a risk perspective and a risk lens. And that's very important. And you would like to focus on those scenarios that show fragmented action that might not be sufficient to reach the Paris climate goals, where you have disruptions, and where one region is doing a lot and another region is not doing much, and you have these leakage effects and these market distortions and all kind of things. I think that's an important set of scenarios. The other important set is to look at the transformative scenarios that bring us actually to these Paris climate goals, and that start acting now on these goals, because as Bob said, it's really important. We are way past time to start acting in this direction. The challenge would have been much smaller if we would have started 20 or 30 years even ago. And the longer we wait, the more disruptive it will become. So what you can see right now is in some geographies, some significant regulation being put in place and legislation. One is Europe with the Green Deal, aiming to become carbon neutral, emissions neutral by mid-century. The other one, the announcement of President Xi on China, that China is aiming to get carbon neutral by 2060. So two big markets now having sent clear signals that they are going in this direction. California also being very ambitious. So I think the signals should be clear now, and that's very important. So the scenarios can help to explore this both worlds, the disruptive ones, where you look at the risk perspective, but also the transformative ones that you use for alignment. So I think that's also very important. In terms of what we can do to connect better to, still better to the users, I see various areas. One area is, of course, thinking about the interfacing of our work and what analysts would do with them, what regulators would do with them. Of course, there are different types of users. So being clearer how we can hand over our work in a transparent way, in a well-documented way, in a public repository, these kind of things is important. Finding a good institutional setup here. The second one is communication. It kind of relates to that. So we really want to be clear what are the assumptions, what is the approach and philosophy. And I put a link in the chat where we try to develop such a concept of climate change scenario services, not only for the finance sector, but for other types of users as well. And you can, this is a prototype developed in a project called Census. So please check it out and see how useful it is, and get back to us with feedback. Well, and the third one is maybe developing our models to better include some information that are critically important. One is, of course, more macro financial information. We have to ask ourselves the question, since we are not resolving the monetary sector, the finance sector explicitly, to what extent we can do that to have these feedback effects a bit included, and these types of questions. So I'm not seeing you all, so I kind of lost you now. So I hope I didn't blow it now. Do you still hear me? I don't see you. I don't hear you.